Hi, my name is Dr. Laura Vietti, and I am the University of Wyoming Geological Museum and Collections Manager. Basically, what that means is I run the UW Geological Museum and I run our collections. Today, I'm going to talk about one of my most favorite topics, the UW Geological Museum. What I'm going to touch points on is a little bit about the history of the UW Geological Museum. I'm going to talk about Wyoming's significant fossils, and I'm also going to touch on student opportunities for working in the UW Geological Museum. So to start, I thought I would start with the state of Wyoming. So I have pictured here a map of the United States, and here I've outlined the state of Wyoming. And what you'll notice is that Wyoming is situated right on top of the Rocky Mountains. So those are those mountain ranges going right through the state. This is important because this mountain range is what gives us all of our amazing fossils. So what is Wyoming known for? Some things you might be familiar with include the Grand Teton Mountain Range. We have Old Faithful at the Yellowstone National Park. We have a very rich American Indian culture, both today and evidence from the past. We have important geologic features like Devil's Tower, which is a preserved volcanic neck. We also have a really thriving cowboy culture here in Wyoming, including several rodeos like the Cheyenne Frontier Day. And of course, we have the University of Wyoming, which is where I got my undergraduate degree many, many years ago. So we're known for all those things, but perhaps more important or more well-known than all of those are Wyoming fossils and our dinosaurs. And so I've pictured here some very classic dinosaurs and fossils that come from Wyoming. And so here in this state, we have fossils that come from almost every geologic period that life existed. And we also have fossils from every type of animal, including mammals, dinosaurs, birds, plants, bats, insects. And as such, people come to Wyoming, excavate our fossils, and put them in museums. So, for example, here I have a whole bunch of different pictures of fossils in museums from all across the world. We have fossils from Wyoming in the American Museum of Natural History, in London, in France, in China. Our fossils from Wyoming are known worldwide. And so we have a very important fossil resource here in the state. So you might be asking yourself, why is Wyoming so fossiliferous? And I've kind of broken it down into 3 points. The first is that Wyoming has always been in the right place at the right time. And what I mean is that we've been somewhere where sediment is collecting, and that's where your fossils or your animals die and they're collected in sediment and then preserved. And so Wyoming has usually had rivers, as I've shown by this map here on the slide, by the star, which is where Wyoming used to be 500 million years ago. We were on the coast. We were the California. And as such, fossils were preserved. So we've always been in an environment where we preserve fossils. This is a cross-section of the state. So if you took Wyoming and sliced it with a knife and you looked on the inside, you would see we have these really deep basins. And these basins represent areas where fossils have been collected. So we have a lot of basins in Wyoming with fossils. So you have basins with sediment, with fossils, but you also need a reason to bring those fossils up to the surface. And so Wyoming has had the Rocky Mountains, and that compressional force causing the Rocky Mountains has basically tilted all of our strata, our sediment, to expose on the surface all of our fossils. And so we have the fossils, and they're also exposed at the surface. The last point is that we have a climate that is helpful for finding fossils. Pictured here is a state called New Jersey, and they also have a lot of fossils, but they also have vegetation and forest. And so the only place to find the fossils is in the river streams where you can find dirt that's exposed. However, in Wyoming, we don't have dense forests. We have broad badlands or desert-like environments. And so the fossils are easy to find because we don't have plants and vegetation covering them up. Lastly, fossil collecting in Wyoming is pretty easy because over half of Wyoming land is federally owned, meaning it's not owned by a single person, but anybody can access this land, which makes it very useful and helpful for finding fossils. However, Not all fossils are legally collectible. Sometimes you have to be a scientist to collect certain types of fossils. But that all leads to why Wyoming has such a rich and diverse amount of fossils. So this is a map of Wyoming, and I don't know if you can see it, but each little black dot represents a fossil locality. And so that's where a fossil has been discovered. And so we have all across Wyoming thousands of black dots, meaning that all across Wyoming we've found fossils. Okay, so I've set the stage for why Wyoming has so many fossils, how important our fossils are. And so I have 4 major talking points for the rest of this presentation. The first is going to be early fossil collection and one of my most favorite topics, the dinosaur wars. Second, I'm going to talk about the history of the UW Geological Museum. Third, I'm going to talk about Wyoming fossils and their significance. So we're just going to take a tour across the state looking at different important fossils. And then lastly, I'm going to touch on student opportunities to work in the Geology Museum. So let's start with early fossil exploration. Fossils have been known in Wyoming since long before explorers came here, including the American Indian culture. And so what I'm showing here is a fossil called a baculite, which is part of a fossil squid, or a fossil, it's kind of like a squid. And American Indians used these and they called them buffalo stones because they looked a lot like bison, which I've shown here. They're also still included today in American Indian practices, indicated by this stone circle with a belemnite, which is a fossil squid in it. But the first official fossil to ever be described from Wyoming was in 1869. This was long before the University of Wyoming existed. This was still when people were first coming out and trapping and hunting in Wyoming. And a rancher found this fossil. And at the time, paleontologists, those are the scientists who study fossils or ancient life, only existed on the East Coast, and there weren't very many of them. So this rancher found this tiny jawbone, which I've pictured here. And this jawbone he sent out to the East Coast, where Joseph Leidy, the leading paleontologist at the time, studied it and published on it. This jawbone belongs to an early primate, so a monkey, one of our ancestors, from about 52 million years ago. Next came O.C. or Othniel Charles Marsh. He had this really smart idea to follow the train. So at the time that he came out, about 1870, the Intercontinental Railroad was still being built. And so what he would do is he's from the East Coast, and he would come out on the train, and when the train stopped because there were no more tracks, he would go collect the area around it. And then when the train went further, he would collect that area around the train tracks. So he found hundreds and hundreds of new, never described fossils just by following the train. However, he took a very long time to publish and name his results. And so this is important because he ended up getting into a major rivalry with another paleontologist. And that paleontologist is Edward Drinkard Cope. Edward Drinkard Cope basically did the same thing. He would come back a couple years after Marsh, and he would also go on the train, collect the areas around, and collect hundreds and hundreds of fossils. Many of them were the same fossils that Marsh had also previously found. But Edward Drinkard Cope would publish much faster and describe them. And so he would put his name on fossils that Marsh had already found. But because he published them first, he got credit. So as you can imagine, Marsh was not happy about this. And so thus began the official Bone Wars of 1870, and it was Marsh versus Cope. And basically, they tried to compete each other to find and name more species than the other. Now, this has had implications at the University of Wyoming. Here I have pictured Marsh and Cope, and then at the base, this is the University of Wyoming Geological Museum. And when it was built, we installed a Brontosaurus. This is the Brontosaurus in about year 1960. But Brontosaurus does not exist. It is a dinosaur that there was nothing like that. And that is because of really bad science done by Marsh when he was competing to name this dinosaur from Cope. Brontosaurus is in fact a Camarasaurus skull on an Apatosaurus body. So there was no Brontosaurus. Since then, we have put the correct skull, an Apatosaurus skull, on that skeleton. So even though we had a Brontosaurus, we officially have an Apatosaurus in our museum. So let's transition to the history of the UW Geological Museum. Here's what it looks like today. And we started back in 1887. So basically when the university started, here's a picture of Old Main. This is the very first building that was built at the University of Wyoming. And you'll notice there's no town around it. That's different today. There's buildings everywhere right now. But this was the very first museum, was inside this Old Main building, and it was both a library and a museum. At the same time, Wilbur Knight, pictured below, was our first geologist and curator. Wilbur passed away, and then we have William Reed became our new curator. And this is the time that the university was building the science hall, which is what I've pictured here. And this is currently the geology department at today as well. Now, William Reed was not a paleontologist by training, but he pretty much self-taught how to find and excavate fossils. And under his curatorship, the Geology Museum had hundreds and hundreds of dinosaur bones, more than many famous museums in the world at that time. So these are just some examples of what the museum looked like. In 1915, Sam Knight, which is the son of Wilbur Knight, our first geologist, took over the museum, and he continued to work on the museum, as I've shown in this picture. And he is responsible for building a brand new wing in 1955. And so that's the museum that currently stands today and that you would visit if you would come to the University of Wyoming. And so he built the museum, he put the original Brontosaurus, now Apatosaurus, and he also built by hand a copper T-Rex statue. This was the first ever statue of a T-Rex that was life-size, and that's still there today. So I hope you get to go see it. In 2009, we made some changes to the museum. We updated it, gave it some new floors, new lighting, but mostly it looks the same as it did in 1955. So today, the museum sees about 22,000 people. We have visitors from every state, and we also have visitors from most countries in the world. So we have, even though we're very small, we have a very broad reach. So now I'm going to go through Wyoming paleontology and sort of highlight important fossils that come from Wyoming, just as a tour of what we have in this amazing state. So to begin with, we have the oldest fossils in the state, and partly almost the oldest in the country. They're called stromatolites. Here I have an example of a fossil one, which looks basically just like a boulder. And this was a mound of bacteria that grew in these mats. There's still some stromatolites alive today, but they're very rare. Importantly, this is 2 billion years old. The next major life, so multicellular life, isn't until 1.5 billion years after this fossil. So it's very old and very important. We have a very diverse amount of fossils that came from an ocean. Wyoming has been under an ocean more than it's been above land. And so very early on, in the Paleozoic, so about 485 to 260 million years ago, we had shallow lagoons covering the state. And we have different rock formations that would look like this today. So what you see here is what you would see representing these ocean environments. But in reality, they looked a lot like this. And so we have fossils like gastropods, orthoceras, we have coral, and we have crinoids, which are sea lilies, all from Wyoming, all way before dinosaurs and humans lived here. We have the Triassic Formation, or the Triassic time, which is our Chugwater Formation. The Chugwater Formation is this really bright red rock formation. It's very famous in Wyoming, and you can't miss it when you're driving through the state. This is the Triassic, so it's the very early part of when dinosaurs lived. And we have a whole bunch of footprints and things like Heptasuchus, which is a very large crocodile relative. In the mid-Jurassic, so still the age of the dinosaurs, we have the Sundance Sea. And so I've pictured over there what the Sundance Formation looks like. It's very green, but it would have looked like this very diverse, beautiful, shallow ocean. And within it, we have examples of fossil squid, so they're those triangle things. And we also have marine reptiles like plesiosaurs and pliosaurs. I've pictured a pliosaur here called Megaloneusis rex. It's a hard one. But it was this very big marine reptile that used flippers. And so there's nothing alive like it today, but they were all over Wyoming at one time. Perhaps the most well-known deposit that we have in Wyoming is called the Morrison Formation, and that's where we have the big dinosaurs. Here's a picture of what the formation looks like. And out of this formation, we get animals like Allosaurus, like our infamous big owl that you can come see here at the University of Wyoming, Camarasaurs, Othnielia rex, Stegosaurus. Some of the most charismatic animals come from this formation. Unknown to most people, though, at the same time as those dinosaurs, mammals, like ourselves, just much smaller, also evolved and lived. And so Wyoming is famous for our tiny, tiny little mammal teeth that lived at the same time as dinosaurs. And these are scientifically very important. We also have a bunch of marine oceans that existed in the Cretaceous, so the last part of the dinosaur era. And we have a diverse amount of ammonites. These are these coiled animals. They would have had tentacles. We also have huge clams. We also had a bunch of marine reptiles like Mosasaurus, which is hanging from the ceiling, and ichthyosaurs, which had these long snouts that would have looked like a dolphin. In the late Cretaceous, we have more charismatic dinosaurs. So we have our Triceratops, we have T-Rex, we have the first ever discovered mummy dinosaur. That was a hadrosaur I've pictured down here. We also still have a record of mammals, which is really scientifically important. So at the KPG transition, this basically means the Cretaceous Paleogene transition. That's when an asteroid came, crashed into the world, wiped out dinosaurs, and enabled mammals to live and flourish. We have in Wyoming a very good record of this extinction event. What that means is that we have animals and mammals from before the extinction and after the extinction. And so researchers from all over the world come to Wyoming just to look at our fossils that record that time period. We also have a ton of Cenozoic mammals. So Cenozoic means the age of mammals, or the time of mammals. And so we have mammals, again, from when dinosaurs lived through the extinction all the way to today. And so Wyoming has one of the best records of how these mammals reacted and evolved and branched out into all the different types of mammals that we have. So this is on the screen. I have just a couple examples of mammals that we find. We have Coryphodon, we have Plesiodapus, that's this tiny little monkey or primate that has relatives to our ancestors. There was the earliest horse, which is that jawbone. And we also have some other animals like Brontotheres and Homo gallix. That's the spinning model that no longer live today. So we have a very diverse set of mammals, even better than dinosaurs. And so most scientists come to Wyoming to study our mammals. We also have something called the Eocene Laggerstaten, or the Green River Formation. And so about 52 million years ago, Wyoming was partially covered by a large freshwater lake. And that lake would have looked something like this. And from that lake, animals would die and be preserved at the bottom of the lake, and they'd be turned into fossils. And we have some of the best fossils in the world from these deposits, including the best record of fossil birds, the best record of fossil bats, insects, we have microbial traces, we have a bunch of mammals, we have snakes. It is one of Wyoming's most famous and important rock formations because the fossils are so well preserved. We have the Oligocene White River Formation. Again, just really beautiful preservation. Lastly, I'm going to touch on the Natural Trap Cave. And so this is something a little bit more recent. This is during the before and through the Ice Age. So that's when Wyoming was covered by ice and snow. And we had giant mammoths and sloths and bears roaming Wyoming landscape. And up in northern Wyoming, there was a cave with a really small opening, and animals would be running along and they'd fall into it. And it basically created this natural deposit of bones at the base of this cave. And because it's a cave, its climate is controlled and it's protected. And so the bones just developed or became fossilized and well preserved, giving us this really good example of what naturally was walking along the landscape. One of the cool things that came from this cave was the very first ever evidence of tuberculosis. So it's a really scientifically important site. So I know that was a lot, and that was just a really, really small portion of all the fossils of Wyoming, but I tried to kind of hit on some of the big ones. If you were to come to Wyoming, you would be able to see quite a few of those in the museum, other museums across the state, and you would even be able to go visit some of those fossil localities. So it's pretty exciting to be here just to see those. So lastly, I wanted to touch on student opportunities. Here I am. This is a picture of myself with a small army of my museum students that work for me in the museum. And I heavily rely on these students to help me. It's just me, and so I have all these students that occupy a variety of different positions for me. And so you just have to be a student at the University of Wyoming in order to work for me. So some of the things that we have available to students, I have students work at the front desk. And so this is perhaps the most important job in the museum because you are the face of the museum. And so you greet people when you come in, you answer questions, you talk on the phone, you tally how many people are there. It is by far the most important job. It's also one of my favorite jobs. We also have a whole bunch of tour guides. And so we get about 2 to 5 tours a week of any type of class, elementary school, middle school, university, and we provide tours. And so that's a pretty fun opportunity that we have. We do a lot of outreach and programming. What that means is I offer a bunch of events where I invite the public to come to the museum. I have interactive tables. I have activities. I'll go to other schools and do interactive activities. And so I heavily rely and have students help me with these activities. And so it's something that I'm always looking for more people to help me with because there's always a need. And we get to do a lot of really fun things. I also have fossil preparation. So in the museum, we have a fossil prep lab, which is what you see here. And that's where we take fossils that we find in the field, we bring them to the university, and we slowly, meticulously remove the rock to expose and preserve the fossil. And so I have a bunch of opportunities for learning how to do this and doing your own project. I also have a very big collection that I oversee. And so I have students help me work on cataloging the collection, databasing the collection, putting and curating specimens into the collection. So that's an opportunity we have. Along those lines, one of the biggest things that I'm currently working on is digitizing our collection. What that means is taking photographs and making those photographs and 3D models publicly available to the world. And so one of my big projects that I have students helping me on is taking both photographs and 3D models of our specimens. And so this is something that I'm very interested in and we're actively working on. Next, we have fieldwork and field trips. So this is perhaps one of the most fun parts about my job is not only do we get to work in the museum, but we get to go out and actually explore and dig up and excavate some of these fossils. And so about once a year, I take a group of students from the museum out and we go collect either a fossil that somebody has told us about, or we collect fossil fish. And so here I have lots of different examples showing what we do. And then lastly, I work with a bunch of students to do their own independent research. And so if we go back to this slide, we dug up a crocodile a couple summers ago, and one of the students worked to prepare that crocodile and then identified it, studied it, and presented on it at a professional conference. And so this is something I heavily encourage, and I'm eager to work with students on. So that pretty much sums up my presentation. I hope you were able to see that Wyoming is incredibly special and that we have so many different types of fossils. The UW Geological Museum is also a very important resource right here at the University of Wyoming, and we welcome and want students to come work for us. Thank you so much for watching.